Mark Bennett's mornings were always the same, steeped in routine and precision, much like the stock markets he so expertly navigated. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the tall windows of his suburban home, he was already dressed in his tailored suit, a dark navy that complemented his graying hair and sharp features. His reflection in the mirror was one of confidence and control, the kind of man who knew how to get what he wanted and keep it. Downstairs, the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the coffee machine. Claire had already prepared breakfast, just as she did every morning, laying out a spread that looked more like a magazine feature than a real meal. She appeared, as always, impeccable in her presentation, her dark hair falling in soft waves, her dress cinched at the waist to highlight her still slender figure, a picture of domestic perfection. "Good morning," she greeted him with a smile, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. Her voice was warm, her manner attentive, but there was something else there too, a hint of distance, a shadow in her eyes that Mark had noticed but never fully acknowledged. "Morning," Mark replied, his tone neutral as he took a sip of the coffee, black, just the way he liked it. He scanned the headlines on his tablet, skimming through the latest market trends and financial news, his mind already running through the day's trades. Lily's excited about her school project, Claire mentioned as she sat across from him, her own cup of tea cradled in her hands. She's been talking about it non-stop. Mark nodded absently, his eyes still on the screen. "That is good. She is a bright kid. She'll do well." Claire's smile faltered for a brief second, but she recovered quickly. "She was hoping you could help her with it this weekend." "I'll see if I can make time," Mark replied, his voice distant, not noticing the slight tightening of Claire's grip on her cup. The conversation dwindled into silence, broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery against porcelain. It was a silence that had grown between them over the years, creeping in like a fog, subtle and almost unnoticeable until it became the new normal. They had once been deeply connected, but life had a way of dulling edges, smoothing out the passion that had once driven them together. As Mark finished his breakfast, he glanced at his watch. "I've got a meeting early today. I'll be home late." Claire nodded, her expression unreadable. "All right, I'll make sure dinner is ready when you get back." "Thanks," Mark said, standing up and kissing her cheek out of habit more than affection. He picked up his briefcase and headed for the door. As he walked out into the crisp morning air, he felt that familiar sense of purpose take hold, the one that had driven him for years to be the best in his field. Yet, as he drove off toward the city, there was a nagging sensation at the back of his mind, something that felt out of place, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. It was the kind of feeling that a man like Mark, so attuned to the rhythms of the market, should have been able to identify an instinct that something wasn't quite right. But he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the day ahead. There were trades to be made, deals to be closed, and nothing was more important than staying on top of his game. Back at the house, Claire watched from the window as Mark's car disappeared down the street. She stood there for a long moment, her tea growing cold in her hands. When she finally turned away, her expression had changed, still composed, but now with a slight edge of resolve. She had a meeting of her own to prepare for, one that Mark knew nothing about. Claire's phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with a message. She glanced at it, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the name. David Caldwell. "Looking forward to seeing you today. Usual place?" Claire's lips curled into a smile, a small thrill running through her as she typed a quick response. "Claire, can tea wait?" With that, she put the phone down and went about her day, the image of the perfect wife carefully maintained, even as the cracks in her life were beginning to widen. Mark, meanwhile, drove on, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface of his carefully constructed life. Claire arrived at the cafe a few minutes early, her heart pounding with anticipation. It was a cozy, discreet spot, nestled in a quiet corner of the city, far from the bustling streets where she and Mark frequented. She chose a table near the back, where the light was dimmer, offering more privacy. As she settled into her seat, she glanced around, noting the other patrons who were too engrossed in their own conversations to pay her any attention. Her phone buzzed again, another message from David, David Caldwell just parked. Be there in a minute. Claire's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as she waited, a mixture of excitement and guilt swirling inside her. The thrill of this clandestine meeting was intoxicating, a sharp contrast to the predictability of her life at home. With Mark, everything was certain, mapped out like one of his investment strategies. But with David, there was a sense of danger, the unknown a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something beyond the numbness that had crept into her marriage. The door chimed as David entered, his eyes immediately locking onto hers. He was dressed casually, in dark jeans and a crisp shirt that hinted at the athletic build underneath. His confident stride and the easy smile that played on his lips were all too familiar to Claire. She had seen that smile countless times at social gatherings, but it had never been directed at her like this. "Hello, beautiful," David greeted her, his voice low and smooth as he took the seat across from her. There was a warmth in his gaze that made Claire's heart flutter, a stark contrast to the cool, detached manner she had become accustomed to at home. "Hi," Claire replied, her own smile blossoming as she leaned in slightly. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to make it. I wouldn't miss this for the world," David said, his hand brushing hers briefly across the table. The contact sent a shiver through her, making her acutely aware of how long it had been since she felt this way desired, seen. They spoke in low tones, their conversation light and filled with the kind of flirtatious banter that had become second nature to them. David complimented her on her dress, on how she carried herself, and Claire soaked it up, craving the attention that had waned in her marriage. She found herself laughing more than she had in weeks, the sound foreign to her ears but welcome nonetheless. "So," David began, his tone shifting to something more serious as he leaned in closer, "how are things with Mark?" The mention of her husband's name brought a flicker of guilt to Claire's expression, but she quickly masked it. "The same as always," she replied, her voice steady. "He is busy with work as usual. I don't think he even notices I'm gone half the time." David nodded, his gaze sympathetic. "You deserve more than that, Claire. You deserve someone who sees you, really sees you." His words struck a chord deep within her, echoing the thoughts she'd been too afraid to voice aloud. It was this sense of validation of being understood that had drawn her to David in the first place. With him, there were no expectations, no obligations, just the thrill of something new, something forbidden. As they continued to talk, the distance between them seemed to close, the outside world fading into the background. Claire found herself opening up to David in ways she hadn't with anyone in years, sharing her fears, her frustrations, her dreams. He listened intently, his attention unwavering, and for the first time in a long time, she felt heard. When their time together drew to a close, David reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We should do this more often," he suggested, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a way that sent warmth coursing through her veins. Claire hesitated for only a moment before nodding, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I do like that." As they parted ways outside the cafe, Claire watched David disappear into the crowd, her mind racing with the possibilities. She knew she was playing with fire, that this secret would eventually catch up to her, but the allure was too strong to resist. The thought of returning to her life with Mark, with its routines and predictability, felt suffocating in comparison. For now, she would keep this part of her life hidden, tucked away where no one could see. It was her little escape, a reprieve from the monotony that had come to define her existence. And as long as Mark remained oblivious, she saw no reason to stop. As Claire made her way back home, the smile lingered on her lips, a flicker of excitement sparking in her chest. She was playing a dangerous game, but for the first time in years, she felt alive. Meanwhile, back at the office, Mark was deeply engrossed in a series of trades, his mind far from the home he had left behind that morning. He had no inkling of the storm brewing just beyond his reach, the distance between him and Claire growing wider with each passing day. For now, he remained focused on the numbers, the patterns, unaware that the most significant shift in his life wasn't happening in the market, but in the very heart of his own home. The evening was warm, the kind of late summer night where the air hung heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of cicadas. Mark arrived home later than usual, the day's work having stretched long into the evening. The house was quiet when he entered, the kind of stillness that felt almost eerie, but he brushed it off as the consequence of a busy week. After all, Claire and Lily were likely upstairs, winding down from their own day. He set his briefcase down by the door, his movements methodical as he loosened his tie and shrugged off his jacket. As he walked through the house, he noticed the absence of the usual signs of life. The TV was off. There were no sounds of laughter or conversation drifting from the living room. It was strange, he thought, but perhaps they were already asleep. It had been a long day for everyone. In the kitchen, he found a note from Claire, propped up against the fruit bowl. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Had a late dinner with Lily. I am heading to bed early, wasn't feeling well. We can talk tomorrow. Mark frowned slightly as he read the note, then set it down. Claire rarely went to bed without at least exchanging a few words with him. But perhaps she really was under the weather. He couldn't remember the last time she mentioned feeling sick. But then again, their conversations had become so perfunctory lately that it was hard to say. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and headed to his study, seeking the comfort of his routine. The leather chair creaked as he settled into it, his fingers tracing the cool glass of the bottle as he leaned back and closed his eyes. The day's stress began to dissipate, but a nagging thought persisted in the back of his mind. Something about Claire's behavior didn't sit right with him. Mark opened his eyes and reached for his phone, scrolling through the latest news before his thoughts drifted back to Claire. Their interactions had been increasingly distant, more like polite exchanges between acquaintances than conversations between a husband and wife. He tried to pinpoint when that shift had occurred, but the timeline was blurred, stretched out over months, maybe even years. As he took a sip of his beer, he recalled the last time they had truly connected. It felt like a lifetime ago, back when their lives were simpler, when they'd talk late into the night about their dreams, their future. But those conversations had faded, replaced by the mundane details of daily life, by the routines that had become so ingrained in them both. Pushing those thoughts aside, Mark turned his attention to the emails that had piled up during the day. There was comfort in work, in the familiar rhythm of numbers and deals, where everything made sense and there were no unanswered questions. Meanwhile, upstairs, Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of her phone on the nightstand. She had been unable to sleep, her mind too restless to find peace. She knew Mark was home, could hear his quiet footsteps downstairs, but the thought of facing him, of engaging in another hollow conversation, filled her with a kind of dread she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't that she didn't care about him anymore, she did, in her own way. But the spark, the connection that had once defined their relationship, felt like a distant memory. She thought of David, of their afternoon together, and a guilty thrill coursed through her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of being alive, of being seen. Claire closed her eyes, trying to push those thoughts away, but they clung to her like a persistent shadow. The truth was, she didn't know how much longer she could keep living this double life, balancing the safety and stability of her marriage with the excitement and danger of her affair. She was walking a tightrope, and she could feel herself starting to slip. Downstairs, Mark stared at the screen, but the words began to blur together. His thoughts kept circling back to Claire, to the distance between them that he had tried so hard to ignore. He set the phone down, rubbing his temples as a sense of unease settled over him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his gut, that instinct that had served him so well in his career now gnawing at him in his personal life. Mark knew he needed to address it, to confront whatever was happening between them, but he wasn't sure how to start. He had always been a man of action, of solutions, but this was different. This was uncharted territory, and he didn't know how to navigate it. Finally, he decided to head to bed, leaving the unresolved thoughts for tomorrow. As he made his way up the stairs, he passed by Lily's room, where the door was slightly ajar. He peeked inside, seeing his daughter fast asleep, her face peaceful and untroubled. The sight of her brought a small smile to his lips, a reminder of the one constant in his life that still brought him joy. But as he reached the door to the master bedroom, that sense of unease returned. He opened the door quietly, stepping inside to find Claire seemingly asleep, her back turned to him. He undressed in silence, careful not to disturb her, before slipping into bed beside her. The distance between them felt palpable, an invisible wall that neither of them acknowledged, but both felt keenly. Mark stared up at the ceiling, his thoughts churning as he tried to make sense of it all. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap that had grown between them, but the words stuck in his throat. And so, the silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, as they lay side by side, worlds apart. Mark eventually drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with indistinct images of markets and numbers. But Claire remained awake, her mind racing with thoughts of David and the life she was leading in the shadows. Neither of them knew it yet, but the cracks in their marriage were deepening, the foundations slowly crumbling under the weight of secrets and unspoken truths. And as the night wore on, the storm that had been brewing beneath the surface began to gather strength, preparing to unleash its full fury on their unsuspecting lives. The following days unfolded in a haze of routine, with each passing moment tinged by the growing tension that neither Mark nor Claire dared to address. They moved around each other, like actors in a well-rehearsed play, hitting their marks but never truly connecting. Mark noticed the small details, the way Claire's smile never quite reached her eyes, the subtle shift in her tone when she spoke to him, the frequent glances at her phone. But he said nothing, unsure of how to begin a conversation that might unravel everything. It was Friday evening when Mark's unease took a more concrete form. He had left work slightly earlier than usual, a rarity for him, hoping to catch Claire off guard. As he pulled into the driveway, the sun casting long shadows over the neatly manicured lawn, he noticed a car parked further down the street, partially hidden by a row of hedges. It was familiar David's sleek black sedan. A prickle of suspicion ran down his spine, but Mark forced himself to stay calm. It could be a coincidence, he reasoned. David had every right to be in the neighborhood, perhaps visiting a mutual friend or simply passing by. But as he walked up to the front door, that instinctual doubt lingered. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that felt deliberate, as though someone was trying to hide something. Mark's footsteps echoed as he made his way to the living room, where he found Claire sitting on the couch, her posture stiff, the book in her hands barely touched. She looked up, her expression one of mild surprise. "You're home early," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Thought I'd wrap up a bit sooner today," Mark replied, his eyes scanning the room as though it might hold some clue. He noticed her phone on the coffee table, screen dark, but close enough that she could easily reach it. "Where's Lily?" "At a friend's house for a sleepover," Claire answered, her gaze flitting to the window for just a second too long. "She'll be back tomorrow." Mark nodded slowly, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the fragments of suspicion that were starting to coalesce. "And you? What have you been up to?" Claire's smile was thin, almost forced. "Just reading, relaxing. It's been a quiet evening." Mark held her gaze, searching for something, anything that might confirm or dispel the gnawing doubt in his mind. But Claire had always been good at masking her emotions, a skill honed over years of social obligations and managing the delicate balances of their life together. If there was something amiss, she wasn't letting it show. "I see," Mark finally said, his tone nonchalant, though his thoughts were anything but. He moved toward the window, casually glancing outside. David's car was still there, the engine now off, its presence a silent specter that refused to be ignored. Claire's voice broke the tension. "Did you want to have dinner now?" "I wasn't sure when you'd be home, so I haven't started cooking yet." Mark turned back to her, masking his inner turmoil with a smile. "No rush. I'm not that hungry right now. Maybe later." She nodded, seeming relieved, and returned to her book, though Mark could tell she wasn't truly reading it. Her eyes remained unfocused, her attention elsewhere. Mark decided to let the matter rest for the moment, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was taking root fast. He knew he needed more than a gut feeling to confront Claire. He needed proof, something concrete that would explain the growing distance between them, the subtle changes in her behavior. That night, after Claire had gone to bed, Mark stayed up, the dim light of his study casting shadows across his face as he scrolled through his phone. He found himself reading through old messages, looking for any sign of change in their conversations. They were polite, cordial, but lacked the warmth that had once been there. Claire had become increasingly brief in her responses, her words careful, almost distant. He switched to her social media profiles, noting the same pattern posts and comments that were all surface level, curated to maintain the image of a perfect life. But there was no trace of David, nothing that might indicate any connection beyond their shared social circle. It was late when Mark finally decided to take a more direct approach. He reached out to Tom Richards, the private investigator he had hired on a whim days earlier, his suspicions vague but growing. Mark had initially asked Tom to look into some business dealings, but now he had a different task in mind. "Tom, it's Mark," he said quietly into the phone, his voice steady despite the tension coiled in his chest. "I need you to look into something else for me. Personal." Tom's reply was immediate, professional. "Of course. What are you looking for?" Mark hesitated, then spoke with a resolve that surprised even him. "I think Claire might be seeing someone. I need you to find out if it is true." There was a pause on the other end, then Tom's calm response. "I'll get started right away. I'll keep you updated." Mark ended the call, his mind buzzing with the implications of what he had just set in motion. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, of getting ahead of problems before they could spiral out of control. But this was different. This was his marriage, his life, and the stakes were far higher than any deal or trade he had ever made. He returned to the bedroom, where Claire lay asleep, her breathing slow and steady. For a moment, Mark just stood there, watching her, trying to reconcile the woman he had loved for so many years with the growing distance between them. Slipping into bed beside her, Mark stared at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling in the darkness. He didn't know what Tom would find, or if there was anything to find at all. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that the life he had carefully built was teetering on the edge of a precipice. And as he closed his eyes, trying to force himself into sleep, he couldn't escape the sensation that the ground beneath him was already beginning to shift. The following week, the tension in the Bennett household became an almost tangible presence. Mark's decision to have Tom investigate Claire's potential infidelity weighed heavily on him, a secret that gnawed at his conscience even as he rationalized it as necessary. He had always been a man who dealt in facts, in evidence, and if there was something going on, he needed to know for certain. Claire, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to Mark's inner turmoil, or perhaps she was simply too preoccupied with her own. She had grown more careful, more deliberate in her actions, as though she sensed the walls closing in. Her meetings with David had become more clandestine, their messages more coded, yet the thrill of their affair had only intensified. Every stolen glance, every brief touch sent adrenaline rushing through her veins, making her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. But with that thrill came a growing sense of paranoia. Claire found herself checking her phone constantly, deleting messages almost as soon as they were sent, and scanning the faces of passers-by when she was out with David. She was careful, yes, but the anxiety that came with maintaining this double life was beginning to take its toll. Mark, for his part, remained outwardly calm, his daily routine unchanged. He went to work, attended meetings, and kept up the appearance of normalcy. But beneath the surface, he was on edge, waiting for Tom's updates like a trader watching the markets for the slightest sign of fluctuation. It was on a Wednesday afternoon when Mark finally received the first piece of information from Tom. He was at his office, staring blankly at his computer screen, when his phone buzzed. Seeing Tom's name on the display, Mark felt his pulse quicken. He picked up the call, his voice steady despite the tension that coiled in his chest. "Mark, it's Tom," the investigator said, his tone professional, but there was something in it that made Mark sit up straighter. "I've got something you'll want to see." "Go on," Mark replied, his voice carefully neutral. "There's been contact between Claire and David Caldwell, several meetings over the past few weeks. I've got photos and timestamps to back it up. They've been careful, but not careful enough." Mark's heart sank as Tom continued to detail the evidence he had gathered: images of Claire and David at the caf, at a secluded park, even leaving a hotel separately but within minutes of each other. It was all there, laid out in stark clarity, confirming what Mark had feared but hadn't been able to admit to himself. "I'll send over the files," Tom concluded, his voice sympathetic. "You can decide what to do next, but I think you've got enough to confront her if that's what you want." Mark ended the call, his hand trembling slightly as he set the phone down. For a moment, he simply sat there, staring at nothing, the reality of the situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. The betrayal, the deceit, it was all too much to process at once. But as the initial shock began to wear off, it was replaced by something else, something colder. He had always prided himself on being in control, on never letting his emotions dictate his actions. And now, more than ever, he knew he needed to stay calm, to think rationally. This wasn't just about Claire and David. It was about his life, his daughter, his future. And he wasn't going to let it all be destroyed by a moment of weakness. Taking a deep breath, Mark opened his email to find Tom's files already waiting for him. He clicked on the first attachment, the photos loading slowly as if to delay the inevitable. The images were clear, unmistakable: Claire and David together, looking far too intimate for any plausible deniability. Mark felt a surge of anger rise up within him, but he pushed it down, forcing himself to stay focused. He needed to be smart about this, to think several steps ahead, just as he did with every trade, every deal. This wasn't just a personal matter, it was a game, and he intended to win. That evening, Mark returned home, his demeanor as calm and collected as ever. He greeted Claire with a kiss on the cheek, noting the way she tensed slightly at his touch, but she quickly masked it with a smile. They had dinner together, discussing Lily's schoolwork, the mundane details of their day, as though everything was perfectly normal. But beneath the surface, the tension between them had become a silent, unspoken force, pulling them further apart even as they went through the motions of their daily life. Later, as they sat together in the living room, Mark watching the news while Claire pretended to read, he decided to make his first move. He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I was thinking," Mark began, his tone casual. "It's been a while since we've taken a trip together. Just the two of us." Claire looked up from her book, surprise flickering across her face. "A trip?" "Yeah," Mark continued, keeping his voice light. "Maybe a weekend getaway? I think it could be good for us. What do you think?" For a moment, Claire hesitated, her mind racing as she tried to gauge his intentions. She hadn't expected this, a suggestion so out of character for Mark, who had always been more focused on work than on leisure. But she couldn't afford to seem suspicious, not now. "That sounds nice," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Where were you thinking?" "Maybe the coast," Mark suggested, watching her carefully. "Somewhere quiet. We could use the time to relax, reconnect." Claire nodded slowly, her thoughts a jumble of conflicting emotions. The idea of being alone with Mark for an entire weekend, especially now, filled her with a sense of dread. But she couldn't refuse without raising questions, so she agreed, already dreading the implications. As they continued their conversation, Mark felt a grim satisfaction settle over him. This was just the beginning, his way of testing the waters, of gauging Claire's reactions. He needed more time to plan, to prepare for what would come next. But he had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. The weekend trip would be a chance to observe Claire up close, to see if she would slip, to understand how deep her betrayal ran. And as Mark watched her return to her book, he knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, he would be ready. The game had begun, and he intended to play it to the very end. The weekend getaway was arranged quickly, with Mark booking a quiet, upscale resort along the coast. It was the kind of place they might have visited in the early years of their marriage, before life became a series of obligations and routines. Claire's reaction to the trip had been cautiously enthusiastic, her agreement tinged with a wariness she tried to hide. On Friday afternoon, they set off, the drive long but scenic. Mark kept the conversation light, talking about work, Lily, and their plans for the weekend. Claire responded appropriately, but Mark noticed the way her gaze drifted out the window more often than usual, as if she were lost in thought, somewhere far from the present moment. When they arrived at the resort, the ocean breeze greeted them, carrying the scent of salt and the distant cry of seagulls. The resort itself was serene, with its whitewashed walls and manicured gardens, a place designed for relaxation and escape. As they checked in and were shown to their room, Mark made a point of touching Claire's back, guiding her as they walked, his gestures affectionate but watchful. The room was spacious, with large windows overlooking the sea, the sound of the waves a constant, soothing presence. Claire stepped out onto the balcony, leaning against the railing as she took in the view. Mark joined her, standing close though not touching. "It's as beautiful here," Claire said, her voice soft, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. "Yeah," Mark agreed, his gaze on the horizon. "I thought it might be nice for us to get away from everything for a bit. No distractions, just us." Claire nodded but said nothing more, her thoughts a tangled mess. She had told David about the trip, her message brief and carefully worded to avoid suspicion. He had responded with understanding, though she could sense the underlying frustration in his words. This weekend felt like a test, one she wasn't sure she wanted to take. Dinner that evening was at the Resort's restaurant, a small, intimate space with candlelit tables and soft music playing in the background. The conversation flowed more easily now, with Claire finally relaxing into the setting. They talked about Lily, reminisced about past vacations, and even shared a few laughs. To an outsider, they would have seemed like any other couple, enjoying a peaceful evening together. But beneath the surface, Mark's mind was constantly at work, analyzing every word, every glance. He could see that Claire was trying, that she was making an effort to engage, but there was still a distance between them, a barrier she wasn't willing or able to cross. As they finished their meal and moved to the bar for a nightcap, Mark decided it was time to plant the first seed. He ordered them both a drink, something light for Claire, knowing she wasn't much of a drinker. As they sipped their cocktails, Mark leaned in slightly, his tone casual. "Have you spoken to David lately?" he asked, keeping his expression neutral. Claire's hand froze on her glass for the briefest of moments, so quick that someone else might have missed it. But Mark noticed, his heart rate steady as he watched her recover. "Not recently," she replied smoothly, taking a sip to hide her discomfort. "Why do you ask?" Mark shrugged, as if the question were of little importance. "Just curious. I haven't seen him around much. Thought maybe he was busy with something." "Maybe," Claire said, her voice calm but with an edge of defensiveness that didn't escape Mark's notice. She changed the subject quickly, steering the conversation away from David, but Mark had already seen what he needed to. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, with Mark keeping the mood light, ensuring that Claire was at ease. But as they returned to their room, that flicker of discomfort in her eyes stayed with him, a reminder that his suspicions were well-founded. The next morning, they spent time on the beach, walking along the shore, their bare feet sinking into the wet sand. Claire seemed more relaxed than she had in weeks, laughing as the waves splashed up around their ankles. Mark played along, his demeanor light, but all the while he was gauging her reactions, looking for cracks in the facade. In the afternoon, they went for a drive along the coast, stopping at a small, picturesque town for lunch. They explored the narrow streets, browsing through quaint shops, the atmosphere almost idyllic. Yet, even in this peaceful setting, Mark couldn't shake the sense that they were both playing roles, maintaining an illusion that neither truly believed in anymore. That evening, back at the resort, Mark suggested they have dinner in their room. He ordered a bottle of wine, something special, and they dined on the balcony, the sun setting over the ocean in a blaze of orange and pink. Claire seemed content, her earlier wariness all but forgotten as the wine loosened her up. They talked more freely now, the conversation drifting from one topic to another, the tension between them momentarily forgotten. It was then that Mark decided to take the next step. As Claire poured them both another glass, he casually mentioned, I've been thinking a lot lately about how things have changed between us. Claire paused, the bottle hovering over his glass. She set it down slowly, her eyes meeting his. What do you mean? Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. I mean, we used to be so close. I know I've been busy with work, and maybe I haven't been as attentive as I should be, but I've noticed you've seemed distant. Claire's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm not sure what you're getting at, Mark. We have both been busy. Life happens. I know, Mark said, his tone gentle, but I want to make sure we're okay, that you are okay. If there's anything bothering you, anything you need to talk about, I am here. For a moment, Claire considered opening up, letting him in on the confusion and guilt that had been eating away at her. But the fear of what that might lead to, of how it might unravel everything she had so carefully balanced, kept her silent. I am fine, really, she finally said, forcing a smile. I appreciate you asking, though. It means a lot. Mark nodded, but he could see the lie in her eyes, the way she avoided his gaze. He knew she wasn't fine, that there was something deeper going on, something she wasn't ready to admit, not to him, and maybe not even to herself. As the night wore on, they finished the bottle of wine, their conversation turning to lighter topics. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Mark knew that it was only a matter of time before it grew into something undeniable. The next morning, they packed their bags and prepared to head home. Claire seemed a bit subdued, her thoughts distant as they checked out of the resort and started the long drive back. Mark, however, felt a grim satisfaction settle over him. He had seen the cracks, the small signs that his suspicions were well-founded, and now he had the information he needed to proceed with his plan. As they pulled into their driveway, the familiar sight of their home greeting them, Claire let out a small sigh of relief. The trip had been more exhausting than she had anticipated, the constant need to maintain her composure weighing heavily on her. She was glad to be home, back in familiar territory where she could regroup and figure out her next move. But as they walked into the house, Mark's hand gently guiding her by the small of her back, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. She didn't know what it was, but she could sense it, a change in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Mark, on the other hand, was already thinking several steps ahead. He knew he couldn't confront Claire just yet, not without more leverage. But he was patient, methodical, and he knew that the game was far from over. As they settled back into their routine, Mark resumed his quiet observation, his every move calculated. He had set the trap, and now it was just a matter of time before it snapped shut, revealing the truth that Claire was so desperately trying to keep hidden. And when that moment came, Mark knew he would be ready, armed with the knowledge and the resolve to take back control of his life, no matter the cost. The days following their return from the coast were a study in quiet tension. Mark continued his routine with the same meticulous precision that had defined his life, but now there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a calm before the storm. He watched Claire more closely than ever, noting every detail, every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. Claire, for her part, tried to resume her life as if nothing had changed, but there was a lingering unease that she couldn't shake, a sense that the walls were slowly closing in on her. The trip had unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Mark's unexpected attentiveness, his probing questions, had made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She knew she needed to be more careful, to cover her tracks more meticulously than before. It was on a Thursday afternoon, when Mark was at work and Lily was still at school, that Claire found herself sitting in the living room, staring at her phone. She had just finished a conversation with Rachel Simmons, who had called to catch up and exchange the latest gossip. The conversation had been light, inconsequential, but it had left Claire feeling oddly restless. Rachel's casual mention of a recent run-in with David had stirred something in her, a reminder of the delicate balance she was struggling to maintain. She opened her messaging app, her fingers hovering over David's name. It had been days since they last spoke, and the silence between them was becoming unbearable. She wanted to reach out, to feel the thrill of their connection again, but she hesitated. The risk felt greater now, with Mark's behavior growing more unpredictable. Finally, unable to resist, Claire typed out a quick message. "Claire, we need to talk. Can we meet?" She sent the message and immediately regretted it, a wave of anxiety washing over her. What if Mark found out? What if he was already suspicious? But before she could dwell on these thoughts, her phone buzzed with a response. David Caldwell. Of course, usual place? Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The usual place, a small, discreet cafe on the other side of town, where they had met many times before. It was safe, familiar, a place where they could pretend, if only for a little while, that the outside world didn't exist. Claire, yes, see you in an hour. She quickly got ready, her movements hurried and deliberate. She told herself it was just a meeting, nothing more. They would talk, and she would return home before Mark or Lily noticed she was gone. Everything would be fine, as long as she stayed in control. An hour later, Claire sat at their usual table, a corner spot that offered a view of the entrance while remaining out of sight from most of the cafe. She had arrived early, as always, to calm her nerves and to ensure that they wouldn't be seen together. The waitress brought her a coffee, and she sipped it slowly, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. When David finally arrived, a wave of relief washed over her. He smiled as he approached, that easy, confident smile that had first drawn her to him. But Claire noticed something different in his eyes today, a hint of concern, maybe even fear. "Hey," David greeted her as he sat down, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Hi," Claire replied, her smile faltering as she studied his face. "You okay?" David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I am fine, just stressed. Things have been crazy at work, and Jessica's been on edge lately. I think she's starting to suspect something." Claire's stomach tightened at his words. She had always known that their affair was risky, but hearing that Jessica might be on to them brought that risk into sharp focus. "What makes you think that?" "She's been asking more questions than usual," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About where I've been, who I've been with. And then there was this strange look she gave me the other day, like she knew something but wasn't saying it." Claire felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She'd been so focused on hiding the affair from Mark that she hadn't considered the possibility of Jessica finding out first. If Jessica confronted David, the entire delicate structure of their secret life could come crashing down. "We need to be more careful," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe we should take a break, just for a little while. Let things cool off." David's expression darkened, a flash of frustration crossing his face. "A break? Claire, we've talked about this. I don't want to lose what we have." "I don't either," Claire replied quickly, her heart pounding. "But we can't keep doing this if it's going to blow up in our faces. If Jessica suspects something, she could go to Mark. We both know what that would mean." David leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. He didn't want to admit it, but Claire was right. They were playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were getting higher by the day. "Fine," he finally said, his voice tight. "We'll lay low for a while, but I'm not giving up on us." Claire nodded, feeling both relieved and conflicted. She didn't want to give up on them either, but the reality of their situation was starting to weigh heavily on her. The thrill that had once made her feel alive now felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. They finished their conversation quickly, both of them eager to get back to their lives before anyone noticed they were gone. As Claire walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end, that their affair was spiraling out of control in ways neither of them could stop. Back at home, Mark was in his study, going over some paperwork when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Tom Richards. "Tom Richards got something new. You'll want to see this." Mark's heart skipped a beat as he opened the message. Tom had attached a few photos, grainy but clear enough to recognize the subjects. Claire and David, sitting together at the cafe, their expressions serious, their body language tense. It was undeniable now the proof was right in front of him. Mark stared at the photos for a long moment, his mind racing. He had suspected, of course, but seeing it laid out so plainly, so blatantly, sent a surge of cold fury through him. They were getting careless, making mistakes. It wouldn't be long before they slipped up completely. He replied to Tom with a simple acknowledgement, his thoughts already moving to the next step. He couldn't confront Claire yet, not while she was still so guarded. But he could use this, twist it to his advantage, push her into making a mistake that would give him everything he needed. The trap was set, and now all Mark had to do was wait. That evening, Claire returned home, her demeanor strained but trying to act as if nothing was amiss. Mark greeted her with the same calm smile he always did, his eyes betraying nothing. They had dinner together, the conversation polite but empty, each of them caught up in their own thoughts. As they went to bed, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind calculating, planning. He knew that the unraveling had already begun, and that soon the truth would come crashing down around them all, and when it did, he would be ready to claim the pieces for himself, no matter the cost. Claire, lying beside him, felt the weight of her decisions pressing down on her, the knowledge that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, one misstep away from falling. But she couldn't turn back now, not after everything she had done. And so, the night passed in silence, both of them waiting for the inevitable, for the moment when everything would finally come undone. The following days passed in a tense and uneasy calm. Claire did her best to maintain the illusion of normalcy, but Mark could see the cracks forming, her composure slipping in subtle ways. She was more distracted, her smile more forced, and her attempts at conversation often fell flat. Mark played his part, responding with the same calm detachment he decultivated over the years, all the while observing her every move with a calculating eye. The weekend was uneventful, spent mostly at home with Lily coming and going from her friends' houses. Mark noted how Claire seemed especially relieved whenever Lily was around, as if their daughter's presence provided a buffer from the tension simmering between them. But it was only a temporary reprieve, a brief lull before the storm he knew was coming. On Monday morning, after Lily had left for school, Mark approached Claire in the kitchen. She was standing by the counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee, her expression distant. "I've been thinking," Mark began, his voice casual. "We should have a dinner party this weekend. Just a few close friends. It's been a while since we've hosted anything." Claire looked up, surprised. "A dinner party?" "Yes," Mark replied smoothly. "I thought it might be a good way to break the monotony. Maybe invite David and Jessica, Greg, Harper, Rachel, the usual group." Claire hesitated, her mind racing. The idea of having David and Jessica in the same room, with Mark watching every interaction, sent a jolt of fear through her. But she couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion, so she forced a smile and nodded. "That sounds nice," she said, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. "I'll start planning the menu." "Great," Mark said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Let me know if you need any help." As Claire turned away, Mark's expression hardened. The dinner party was a calculated move, a way to bring all the players together and observe their interactions under his watchful eye. He knew that in a social setting with everyone relaxed and their guards lowered, the truth would be more likely to slip out, and when it did, he would be ready. The week passed in a flurry of preparations. Claire threw herself into the task, using it as a distraction from the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her. She spent hours planning the menu, arranging the seating, making sure every detail was perfect. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner party was a prelude to something far more sinister. On Saturday evening, the house was filled with the scent of roasted meats and rich sauces, the dining room table set with the finest china and crystal. Mark moved through the house with a calm efficiency, checking on the arrangements, offering Claire words of encouragement that felt hollow to both of them. By the time the first guests arrived, Claire's nerves were stretched thin, her smile barely masking the anxiety beneath. The evening began pleasantly enough, with everyone exchanging pleasantries and catching up on the latest gossip. Mark played the gracious host, keeping the conversation flowing, while Claire busied herself with serving drinks and making sure everyone was comfortable. But as the night wore on and the wine flowed more freely, the atmosphere began to shift. David and Jessica arrived together, both of them impeccably dressed, their smiles bright but strained. Mark greeted them warmly, his handshake with David firm, lingering just a moment too long. Jessica seemed more subdued than usual, her gaze flickering between David and Claire with an intensity that didn't go unnoticed by Mark. The guests mingled in the living room, sipping their drinks and chatting in small groups. Mark watched as David gravitated toward Claire, their conversation polite but tense. Jessica, meanwhile, kept a close eye on them, her smile growing tighter with each passing minute. As they all sat down to dinner, Mark made sure to seat himself across from Claire, with David and Jessica to her left. The seating arrangement was intentional, designed to keep everyone in his line of sight. The conversation started off light, with Mark steering it towards neutral topics: work, travel, their children's achievements. But as the meal progressed, he began to introduce more pointed questions, probing into the relationships between his guests. "So, David," Mark said, his tone casual as he cut into his steak, "how has business been lately? I have noticed you've been keeping a low profile." David tensed slightly, but quickly recovered. "Things have been busy," he replied smoothly. "I've been focusing on a few new projects, trying to stay ahead of the curve." "Busy enough to keep you away from home?" Mark asked, his eyes locking onto David's. David hesitated, sensing the trap but unsure of how to avoid it. "You know how it is," he said, forcing a smile. "Sometimes work demands more of your time than you'd like." Jessica's gaze sharpened at that, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. Mark didn't miss the flicker of tension between them, and he pressed on, his voice soft but insistent. "Must be tough on you, Jessica," Mark continued, his tone sympathetic. "David's been working so hard, it is a wonder you two find time for each other." Jessica smiled tightly, her eyes never leaving her husband's. "We make it work," she said, her voice steady, but Mark could hear the edge beneath it. "And what about you, Claire?" Mark asked, turning his attention to his wife. "You've been holding down the fort while I've been busy with work. It can't be easy." Claire's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "We all have our challenges," she said, her voice even, "but we manage." Mark smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He could feel the tension in the room building, the subtle glances, the tightening of smiles, the way the conversation faltered as everyone tried to navigate the undercurrents of unease. He had set the stage, and now all he had to do was wait. As the meal drew to a close, Mark rose to make a toast. He held up his glass, his expression thoughtful. "To friends, to family, and to the truth that binds us all," he said, his gaze sweeping across the table, lingering on David, then Claire. The words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on the group. Claire's hand trembled as she raised her glass, her mind racing with thoughts of what Mark might know, what he might be planning. She caught David's eye, and the silent exchange between them was enough to confirm her worst fears. This wasn't just a dinner party. It was something far more dangerous. After dessert, the guests began to drift back to the living room, the atmosphere more subdued than before. Mark stayed behind, offering to help Claire clear the table. As they worked in silence, the tension between them became almost unbearable. Finally, as they stood alone in the kitchen, Mark turned to Claire, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad we did this," he said, his voice low. "It's been a long time since we had everyone together." Claire forced a smile, but she could feel the cracks widening. "Yes, it was nice." Mark studied her for a moment, then reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was tender, but there was a coldness in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. "Get some rest," he said softly. "You've had a long day." Claire nodded, her throat tight. I will. Mark watched as she turned and left the kitchen, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. He remained where he was, his hands resting on the edge of the counter, his mind already working through the next phase of his plan. The evening had gone exactly as he had hoped. The subtle tensions, the unspoken words all playing out like a carefully orchestrated symphony. He knew now that the time was almost right, that the truth was on the verge of coming to light. And when it did, Mark would be ready to deal with the fallout, no matter how devastating it might be. Upstairs, Claire sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. She could feel the walls closing in, the life she had so carefully constructed beginning to unravel before her eyes. She knew that Mark was onto something, that he was watching her every move, waiting for her to slip. She had to be careful, had to think fast, or everything she had fought so hard to keep hidden would come crashing down around her. As she lay down to sleep that night, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the dinner party had been a turning point, a moment of no return. And deep down, she knew that the reckoning she had been dreading was now closer than ever. The tension from the dinner party lingered like a dark cloud over the following days, settling into every corner of Claire's life. She found herself constantly on edge, her thoughts racing as she tried to anticipate Mark's next move. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on, that he was waiting for the perfect moment to confront her. Mark, however, continued to play his role with calculated precision. He maintained his routine, acted the part of the attentive husband, and made no overt moves to suggest he was aware of Claire's secret. But beneath the surface, he was meticulously planning his final strike, waiting for the right moment to bring everything crashing down. On Thursday evening, Mark received a text from Tom Richards. Tom Richards, it's time. I've gathered everything you need. Let me know when you are ready to move forward. Mark read the message, his pulse quickening. The time had come. He had everything he needed to take control of the situation, to expose Claire's betrayal and to ensure that he came out on top. But he knew that this would require precision and timing. One wrong move could unravel everything. He replied to Tom, setting up a meeting for the next day. Then he slipped his phone back into his pocket and headed upstairs, where Claire was getting ready for bed. When he entered the room, she looked up, forcing a smile. Long day? Yeah, Mark replied, his tone casual. But it's almost the weekend. Thought we could do something special on Saturday? Maybe take Lily out to that new restaurant in town? Claire nodded, her mind already racing. The suggestion was unexpected, and she couldn't help but wonder if there was an ulterior motive behind it. But she forced herself to relax, knowing that she needed to keep up appearances. That sounds nice. Mark smiled, though his eyes remained distant. Great, I'll make the reservation. He moved to the bathroom to get ready for bed, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. As she lay down, she tried to piece together the puzzle, to understand what Mark was planning. But the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. He was playing his cards close to his chest, and she had no way of knowing what his next move would be. The next day, Mark left work early and met Tom Richards at a small, nondescript cafe in the city. Tom was already seated at a corner table, a thick envelope resting in front of him. When Mark arrived, Tom nodded in greeting and slid the envelope across the table. Everything is in there, Tom said quietly. Photos, documents, even a few recorded conversations. It's all airtight. Mark took the envelope, his expression unreadable. Good work, Tom. Tom leaned back in his chair, studying Mark's face. You are sure about this? Once you open that envelope, there's no going back. Mark nodded slowly, his grip tightening on the envelope. I'm sure. Tom didn't press further. He had been in this line of work long enough to know when a client's mind was made up. If you need anything else, you know how to reach me. Mark stood up, slipping the envelope into his briefcase. I'll be in touch. As he left the cafe, Mark felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The decision had been made, and now all that was left was to execute it. He knew that once he opened that envelope, everything would change, but he was ready for it. Claire's betrayal had shattered the life they had built together, and now it was his turn to take control. That evening, Mark returned home and found Claire in the living room, flipping through a magazine. He watched her for a moment, noting the way she seemed more relaxed than she had been in days. It was as if she believed that the worst was behind them, that whatever tension had existed between them was starting to fade. But Mark knew better. "I've got a little surprise for you," Mark said, his tone light. Claire looked up, curious. "Oh, what is it?" Mark smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I was thinking we could have a date night tomorrow, just the two of us. It's been a while since we spent some quality time together." Claire hesitated, sensing the trap but unable to refuse without raising suspicion. "That sounds lovely." "Great," Mark said, his voice smooth. "I'll take care of everything, just be ready by 7. Claire nodded, forcing a smile, but as Mark turned away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next evening, Claire dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant dress that she knew Mark liked. She spent more time on her hair and makeup than usual, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in the pit of her stomach. She couldn't remember the last time they had gone out on a date, just the two of them, and the suddenness of Mark's suggestion had left her on edge. When she came downstairs, Mark was waiting for her, looking impeccably put together in a dark suit. He smiled as she approached, offering her his arm. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Claire replied, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. They drove to the restaurant in silence, the tension between them thick and oppressive. Claire glanced out the window, trying to calm herself, but every passing streetlight only heightened her anxiety. She knew that something was coming, that Mark had planned this night for a reason, but she had no idea what that reason might be. When they arrived at the restaurant, Mark led her to a private dining room in the back, away from the main crowd. The room was dimly lit, with a single candle flickering in the center of the table. The atmosphere was intimate, almost too much so, and Claire felt her nerves fraying. They ordered their meals, and Mark kept the conversation light, asking about her day, about Lily, about the plans she had been making for the weekend. But there was an edge to his voice, a subtle undertone that made Claire feel as though she were being interrogated. Finally, after the main course had been served, Mark set down his fork and looked Claire directly in the eyes. "There is something I have been meaning to ask you." Claire's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, almost detached. "Are you happy, Claire?" The question took her by surprise, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. "What do you mean? Are you happy?" Mark repeated, his gaze unyielding. "With us, with our life, with everything." Claire hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to lie, to tell him that everything was fine, that she was content. But the look in Mark's eyes told her that he wouldn't believe her, that he was waiting for something else. I don't know," Claire finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "I see." There was a long silence, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Finally, Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table to Claire, his expression unreadable. "What's this?" Claire asked, her hands trembling as she picked up the paper. "Open it," Mark said simply. Claire unfolded the paper, her eyes widening as she read the words written there. It was a receipt from a hotel. The date was recent, only a few weeks ago, and the names on the receipt were unmistakable: David Caldwell and Claire Bennett. Her heart dropped, the blood draining from her face. She looked up at Mark, her mind reeling, trying to find something to say, but the words wouldn't come. "I've known for a while," Mark said quietly, his voice cold. "I've known about you and David. I know everything." Claire felt the room spinning, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Mark, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," Mark interrupted, his tone icy. "You betrayed me, Claire. You lied to me. You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer, and I let you, because I wanted to see how far you would go." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had been so careful, so sure that Mark wouldn't find out, and yet here he was, with undeniable proof of her infidelity. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, Mark. Sorry doesn't change anything," Mark replied, his expression hardening. "It doesn't change what you did. It doesn't change what I have to do now." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, fear gripping her as she realized the full extent of what Mark was saying. "What are you going to do?" Mark's gaze was cold, unyielding. "I'm going to take everything from you. The house, the car, custody of Lily. You will have nothing, Claire. Nothing but the consequences of your own actions." Claire's breath hitched, her mind unable to process the magnitude of what Mark was saying. She had never imagined that he would go this far, that he would be capable of such cold, calculated revenge. "Please, Mark. Don't do this," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "We can work this out. We can fix this." But Mark shook his head, his expression resolute. "It's too late for that, Claire. You made your choice. Now you'll have to live with it." As he stood up to leave, Claire reached out, grabbing his arm in desperation. "Mark, please." Mark looked down at her, his eyes filled with a cold, unwavering determination. "Goodbye, Claire." He pulled away from her grasp and walked out of the room, leaving Claire alone in the dimly lit dining room, the weight of her betrayal crashing down on her like a tidal wave. The reckoning had come, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Mark returned home after the dinner, leaving Claire at the restaurant to process the full weight of her impending downfall. The cold satisfaction of having finally confronted her simmered in his chest. But he knew the hardest part was still ahead. He wasn't just out to expose Claire, he was determined to dismantle every aspect of her life, piece by piece. The house was quiet when he entered, the kind of stillness that felt almost unnatural. Lily was asleep, her room dark and peaceful. Mark lingered outside her door for a moment, the reality of what he was about to do casting a shadow over him. He had no intention of hurting his daughter, but he knew there would be collateral damage in this war. For now, he pushed that thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. He headed to his study and opened the envelope Tom Richards had given him earlier. Inside were the final documents he needed: bank statements, emails, and a list of assets tied to both him and Claire. Mark reviewed each document with meticulous care, ensuring every detail was correct. He had been careful not to leave any loose ends, and now it was time to put everything into motion. The first step was securing full custody of Lily. Mark had been gathering evidence of Claire's infidelity for months, and he knew that the courts would favor him once the truth came out. He had already contacted Sophie Grant, the ruthless divorce attorney who had a reputation for being unyielding in court. Sophie had assured him that with the evidence he had, winning custody would be a straightforward process. Mark sent Sophie a text, confirming their meeting for the following day. He had decided to file for divorce immediately, leveraging the affair and Claire's lack of attention to their daughter to make his case airtight. He knew that Claire would be blindsided by the speed of it all, but that was the point. He wanted her off balance, reeling from one blow after another, until she had no choice but to accept defeat. With the legal aspects set in motion, Mark turned his attention to the financial side. He had already moved significant assets into accounts Claire couldn't touch, ensuring that she would be left with almost nothing. The house, the cars, the savings, they were all now under his control, thanks to a series of quiet maneuvers he made over the past few weeks. All that was left was to finalize the transfer of funds, ensuring that when the dust settled, Claire would be left with only a fraction of what they had built together. The following morning, Mark was up early, his mind sharp and focused. He had barely slept, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him alert. He went through his routine with practiced ease, making breakfast for Lily and dropping her off at school, all while maintaining the calm facade he had perfected. Claire had come home late, well after Mark had gone to bed. She had hoped to talk to him, to plead for forgiveness, but the sight of his empty side of the bed had left her feeling more alone than ever. Now, as she moved through the house in a daze, she was struck by how different everything felt, how final Mark's words had been. She knew she needed to talk to him, to try and salvage what was left of their marriage, but she couldn't shake the fear that it was too late. Mark had been so cold, so resolute, and she had seen in his eyes that he meant every word he had said. Still, she had to try. She couldn't lose everything. Not like this. Mark arrived at Sophie Grant's office with a sense of grim determination. Sophie greeted him with her usual professional demeanor, her sharp eyes taking in his expression as she led him to her office. "Everything is in place," Sophie began as they sat down. "The paperwork is ready to be filed, and with the evidence you have provided, there's no doubt the court will grant you full custody of Lily. As for the financials, I've reviewed the accounts and transfers. Claire will have little to contest." Mark nodded, satisfied. "Good. I want this done quickly." "It will be," Sophie assured him. "Once we file, the clock starts ticking. Claire won't have time to mount any significant defense. We'll make sure of that." Mark thanked Sophie and left her office, his mind racing with the next steps. He had one more thing to take care of before the endgame began. He needed to confront David Caldwell. David had been avoiding Mark since the dinner party, sensing that something was wrong, but not wanting to face the consequences of his actions. But Mark wasn't going to give him that luxury. He needed to send a message to David, to Claire, and to anyone else who thought they could undermine him. Mark drove to David's office, his grip tight on the steering wheel. When he arrived, he walked in without announcing himself, striding past the receptionist and into David's office. David looked up, startled to see Mark standing in his doorway, his expression a mix of surprise and fear. "Mark, I wasn't expecting you," David began, his voice shaky. "I am sure you weren't," Mark replied coldly, closing the door behind him. David stood, his hands trembling slightly. "Look, if this is about you betraying me," Mark cut in, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been sleeping with my wife, David. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" David paled, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the right words. "Mark, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Save it," Mark snapped. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I want you to understand exactly what you have done." David's eyes widened as Mark stepped closer, his anger palpable. "You've destroyed your career, David. As of today, your partnership in the firm is revoked. Your accounts are frozen, and any deals we had in place are canceled. You are done." David's knees buckled, and he fell back into his chair, his face ashen. "Mark, please, you should have thought about that before you went behind my back," Mark said coldly. "This is just the beginning. You'll see the full extent of what you have lost soon enough." With that, Mark turned on his heel and walked out of the office, leaving David to contemplate the ruin of his career and his life. There was no satisfaction in the act, no sense of triumph, just the cold certainty that he had done what needed to be done. As Mark left the building, his phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. "Sophie Grant, the papers are filed. It's done." Mark exhaled slowly, the weight of the last few days settling on him. The trap had been sprung, and now all that was left was to watch as everything fell into place. When he arrived home that evening, the house was quiet once again. Claire was sitting in the living room, her face drawn and pale. She looked up as Mark entered, her eyes filled with desperation. "Mark, we need to talk," she began, her voice trembling. "There's nothing left to talk about," Mark replied, his tone firm. "It's over, Claire." Claire's breath hitched, her eyes welling with tears. "Please, Mark. I can lose Lily. Dawn to take her away from me." Mark's expression remained cold, unyielding. "You should have thought about that before you betrayed me." He turned away from her, heading upstairs to his study, leaving Claire to collapse into sobs on the couch. The sound echoed through the empty house, a stark reminder of the life that was now shattered beyond repair. Upstairs, Mark sat at his desk, staring out the window as the last light of day faded into darkness. The battle was over, the pieces falling into place just as he had planned. But as he sat there, alone in the silence, he couldn't help but feel a hollow emptiness settle over him. He had won, but at what cost? The days that followed felt surreal, as though the world had shifted on its axis, leaving everyone scrambling to find their footing. Mark moved through the days with a calm efficiency, checking off each task on his list with methodical precision. The divorce papers had been served, and Claire had reacted exactly as he had expected, shocked, devastated, and utterly unprepared. The reality of her situation was sinking in fast, and Mark knew it was only a matter of time before she crumbled completely. Lily, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her, continued with her routines, though even she began to sense the tension between her parents. Mark made sure to shield her from the worst of it, maintaining a facade of normalcy as much as possible. He knew that Lily would eventually have questions, but for now, he focused on ensuring that her life remained as stable as possible. Claire, on the other hand, was falling apart. The divorce papers had been like a death sentence, spelling out in stark, cold language the end of everything she had known. She couldn't believe how quickly Mark had moved, how thoroughly he had dismantled her life. The financial blow had been devastating. Mark's careful maneuvering had left her with almost nothing, and the prospect of losing Lily was too much to bear. She had tried to contact David, hoping for some support, some comfort in the midst of her nightmare, but he had gone silent. His career was in shambles, and he was dealing with his own fallout. In a matter of days, everything Claire had counted on had crumbled into dust. By midweek, she could no longer face the empty house that had once been her home. The walls seemed to close in on her, the memories of happier times mocking her with their presence. She felt like a ghost, haunting a life that no longer existed. Desperate, Claire decided to reach out to Rachel Simmons. Rachel had always been a good friend, someone who could provide a listening ear and offer advice. But when Claire called, Rachel's tone was guarded, distant, and Claire could tell that the news had already spread through their social circle.
"Claire,"
Rachel said, her voice tense.
"I heard about what is happening. I'm so sorry. Rachel, I don't know what to do."
Claire's voice trembled as she fought back tears.
"Mark, he is taking everything. Lily, the house, I can't lose them."
Rachel hesitated, her silence speaking volumes. When she finally spoke, her words were careful, measured. "Claire, you have to understand. This is serious. Mark isn't playing around. You need to get a good lawyer, someone who can help you fight this."
"I don't have the money for that,"
Claire replied, her voice cracking.
"He has taken everything. I am completely lost."
There was another pause, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice was softer, tinged with regret.
"I wish I could do more, Claire, but things are complicated right now. People are talking, and I have to think about my family."
Claire's heart sank as the full weight of Rachel's words hit her. Even her friends were abandoning her, distancing themselves from the wreckage of her life. She had never felt so alone, so utterly betrayed.
"Rachel, please. I need someone to talk to. I don't know where to turn."
But Rachel's response was cold, almost dismissive.
"I'm sorry, Claire, I really am.
But I think it is best if we take a step back, at least for now. You need to focus on getting through this, and I have to protect my own." Claire didn't have the strength to argue. The call ended with a hollow click, and she stared at the phone in her hand, the realization slowly dawning on her that she was truly, completely alone. Meanwhile, Mark continued with his plans, unfazed by the chaos he had unleashed. He met with Sophie Grant to finalize the legal proceedings, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. Sophie, ever the professional, was efficient and unflinching, guiding Mark through the process with the same ruthless precision she was known for. "It's almost done," Sophie told Mark during their final meeting. "The court will rule in your favor, and Claire will have no choice but to accept the terms. As for custody of Lily, I see no reason why the judge won to grant you full custody. Claire's position is weak, and with the evidence we've presented, it's clear that she's unfit." Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. I want this over with." Sophie offered him a rare smile, one that was more about professional satisfaction than warmth. "It will be. You've handled this well, Mark. You've secured your future and Lily's. That's what matters." Mark left Sophie's office feeling a sense of closure, but there was no joy in it. The victory was his, but the cost had been high. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling of emptiness that had settled in the pit of his stomach. He had spent so much time planning, maneuvering, ensuring that he would come out on top, but now that it was nearly over, he was left with a hollow victory. When he arrived home, He found Claire in the living room, sitting in the same spot where she had broken down days earlier. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Mark," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk? Please?" Mark considered her for a moment, then nodded. He sat down across from her, his expression hard but not unkind. "I know I've hurt you," Claire said, her voice trembling. "I know I betrayed you, and I am so sorry for that, but please, Mark, don't take Lily from me. Don't take everything." Mark's gaze was steady, unyielding. "This isn't just about you and me, Claire. This is about what is best for Lily, and after everything that has happened, I don't think you're in a position to provide that." Claire's breath hitched, her tears spilling over. "Mark, please, I can lose her. She's all I have left." Mark remained silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and firm. "You should have thought about that before you decided to betray our family. This is the consequence of your actions, Claire, and now you have to live with it." The finality of his words crushed any remaining hope Claire had. She knew then that there was no chance of reconciliation, no possibility of repairing the damage that had been done. Mark had made up his mind, and there was nothing she could do to change it. As Mark stood to leave, Claire felt a deep, overwhelming despair wash over her. The life she had known was gone, shattered beyond repair, and she had no one to blame but herself. Mark left the room without another word, retreating to his study. He closed the door behind him, the weight of everything finally settling on his shoulders. He had done what he set out to do, but the victory felt hollow, the satisfaction fleeting. He had won, but at a cost he wasn't sure he was prepared to pay. As he sat in the dim light of his study, the silence pressing in around him, Mark realized that in destroying Claire, he had also destroyed a part of himself. The man he had been the loving husband, the devoted father was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, someone who had sacrificed everything for the sake of control. And as the night wore on, Mark couldn't help but wonder if the price of victory had been too high after all. The final court ruling came swiftly, just as Mark had expected. The judge granted him full custody of Lily, citing the evidence of Claire's affair and her subsequent instability as sufficient grounds. The divorce settlement left Claire with little more than her personal belongings and a modest amount of spousal support. Mark had ensured that she would be left with barely enough to start over, her life reduced to fragments of what it once was. The official end of their marriage came on a gray afternoon, the courtroom empty save for the judge, their lawyers, and a handful of staff. Claire sat across from Mark, her once vibrant presence now diminished to a shadow of the woman she had been. She barely reacted as the judge announced the final decision, her eyes vacant, her spirit seemingly broken. Mark maintained his composure throughout the proceedings, his expression unreadable. When it was over, he stood up and left the courtroom without a word, not even glancing in Claire's direction. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, the price of his vengeance weighing heavily on him. Outside the courthouse, the cold winter air stung his face as he walked to his car. The sky was overcast, the world around him painted in shades of gray. Mark got into his car and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The sense of finality that had settled over him was suffocating. Everything he had fought for, everything he had planned, had come to fruition, but at what cost? As he drove home, the streets blurred together, his mind wandering back to the beginning, to the life he had once had with Claire. They had been happy once, or at least he thought they had. But somewhere along the way, they had lost each other, their marriage eroded by time, by neglect, by secrets and lies. Mark couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different if he had seen the signs earlier, if he had tried harder to save what they had instead of focusing solely on his own ambitions. When Mark arrived home, the house was quiet, the kind of silence that had become all too familiar. Lily was at school, and the emptiness of the house seemed to echo with the ghosts of the life they had once shared. Mark walked through the rooms, each one a reminder of what had been lost of the family that had been torn apart by betrayal and revenge. He found himself in the living room, standing in front of the fireplace where so many of their family moments had taken place. The memories came rushing back: Lily's first steps, the laughter and warmth of holidays spent together, the quiet evenings where he and Claire had simply enjoyed each other's company. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the events of the past few months. Mark sat down on the couch, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The house, once a symbol of their success, now felt like a monument to failure. He had won, but in doing so, he had lost something far more valuable: his sense of self, his connection to the life he had built, the love he had once felt. Days turned into weeks, and life continued its slow, steady march forward. Mark tried to find solace in his work, in the routines that had always brought him comfort, but the emptiness remained. He had achieved everything he had set out to do, but the satisfaction he had expected never came. Lily, unaware of the full extent of what had happened between her parents, continued to live her life as normally as possible. Mark did his best to be there for her, to provide the stability she needed, but he could see the confusion in her eyes, the way she seemed to sense that something was missing. She asked about Claire less frequently as time went on, but when she did, the questions were tinged with a sadness that Mark couldn't ignore. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Lily looked up at Mark, her voice hesitant. "Dad, do you think Mom will ever come back?" Mark paused, his heart clenching at the question. He had tried to prepare for this, to find the right words to explain to Lily why her mother was no longer a part of their lives. But in that moment, faced with his daughter as innocent hope, he struggled to find an answer. "I don't know, Lily," he finally said, his voice soft. "Your mom is going through a lot right now, but she loves you, and I'm sure she'll always want to be a part of your life." Lily nodded, her eyes downcast as she played with her food. "I miss her." Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know, sweetie. I miss her too." The admission surprised him, the truth of it hitting him harder than he had expected. He did miss Claire, despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal and the lies. He missed the life they had once shared, the connection that had once been so strong. But he also knew that there was no going back, no undoing what had been done. As the weeks turned into months, Claire's presence in their lives became a distant memory. She had moved to a small apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the life of comfort she had once known. Mark had ensured that she would have enough to get by, but nothing more. It was a life of quiet desperation, of trying to rebuild from the ashes of what had been. Claire's days were filled with regret, with the constant gnawing pain of what she had lost. She tried to find solace in her new routine, in the small mundane tasks that filled her days, but the emptiness remained. She had lost Mark, she had lost Lily, and she had lost herself in the process. Every now and then, she would find herself walking past the old house, the place that had once been her home. She would pause, looking at the windows where the lights glowed softly, imagining the life that continued inside without her. The pain was almost too much to bear, but she forced herself to keep moving, to keep walking, knowing that she was no longer a part of that world. One evening, as she passed by the house, she saw Mark standing in the living room, his figure silhouetted against the light. He was staring at the fireplace, lost in thought, and for a moment, Claire was overwhelmed by the urge to go to him, to beg for forgiveness, to try and rebuild what they had lost. But she knew it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. Mark never saw her standing there, just as he had never seen the slow unraveling of their marriage until it was too late. The life they had built together was gone, replaced by something cold and empty, a testament to the choices they had both made. As Claire turned away from the house and walked into the night, the echo of their past lingered in the air, a reminder of what had been and what could never be again. And so, the story of Mark and Claire ended not with a dramatic confrontation or a final explosive moment, but with a quiet, lingering sadness, a life torn apart by betrayal, by secrets, by the slow, inevitable erosion of love. The echoes of their choices reverberated through the silence, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal and some losses are too great to overcome. In the end, they were left with nothing but memories and the knowledge that the price of betrayal is a burden that can never truly be lifted. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to my channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story and what stories you want to hear.